I'd like to first start off by thanking Fred for extending to me this invitation to speak to you about Singapore. Singapore is a story that's been on my mind since 1983. After Ghana's last military coup, some of the supporters of that coup extolled its virtues by pointing out that there was a dictatorship, Cuba, where education and healthcare was of a very high order. The insinuation was that to some degree, coercion was necessary for progress. I found that a somewhat difficult proposition to accept. In my search to counter the proposition, I went to look for a British colony which had to be in the tropics, it had to be tiny, it had to be capitalist, and it had to do well for its people. In my lunch breaks, I would go to the British Council Library and leaf through the Encyclopedia Britannica, and eventually I found Singapore. I was delighted. I shared Singapore with my friends, and they said then, it doesn't apply to Africa. I then got on the plane to go to Canada to study. This might sound apocryphal, but I was in London for a week. One day, standing by the bus stop, the buses took a long time to arrive. To my left was a Nigerian, to my right was a Singaporean. People who know me know that I love to talk, even to strangers. So I managed to get the Singaporean and the Nigerian in conversation. After a long while, 3 buses arrived. I was impressed. The Nigerian said, in my country, the buses would never arrive. The Singaporean said, in my country, 3 buses would not arrive at once. This is Singapore in 1960. Notice in the lower corner, shacks and huts. Look at a skyscraper skyline today. 1960, you see Kinshasa, high buildings, wide boulevards. This is Kinshasa today. It's difficult to discern the boulevard, clearly a lot of shacks. There is Lagos, 1960. It's somewhat a relief to see that Lagos looks unchanged. Chaos on one side, concentrated chaos on the other. It is not the case that Singapore was as poor as Africa. It has always been a more prosperous place, but it was dealt a similar set of cards. It is a city-state, which is unusual in our part of the world, but it was a British colony. Unlike Africa, it was occupied by the Japanese during the Second World War. It has ethnic groups and had racial riots aplenty. It had masses who wanted instant gratification. Unlike Africa, it was next to a couple of communist insurgencies. Not the Cold War that we like to talk about, hot war. Look at the ethnic pattern of Singapore. It's about 76% Chinese, 14% Malay, and the balance Indians. Rwanda and Burundi are more homogeneous than Singapore. Zimbabwe is even more homogeneous than Rwanda and Burundi. Rwanda and Burundi have had pogroms from time to time. Zimbabwe has had its difficulties. Unlike many countries, Singapore elected to follow the path of multi-ethnic meritocracy. Each person paid according to their ability and their performance. It eschewed a path of communalism, which is a path followed by Malaysia, a path in which people are rewarded in whole or in part for their membership in a group which has typically suffered in some way or has some kind of primordial privileges. It eschewed also the path of communism. A system of meritocracy can only work if it is predicated on economic freedom. The freedom of individuals to do what they want, the freedom of individuals to compete, property to be protected, private property, voluntary market exchange. Singapore was most unusual in the early 60s in hewing to that path. As it turns out, economic freedom is highly correlated with increases in GDP per capita. You'll notice that Singapore is comfortably ensconced between the USA and Japan, and Hong Kong not too far off. The African countries are in their usual position at the bottom: Zimbabwe, Uganda, Nigeria, low economic freedom, arguably economic servitude, and poverty. So keep that in mind. The spread of economic freedom is a prerequisite for prosperity. How do we get economic freedom? Well, it starts with a small government, which I would define as a government with a revenue roughly equal to 20% or less of GDP, impartial courts of high caliber, low money growth, low inflation, 4% or less, minimal taxes on international trade, low minimum wages, so that the private sector and employees can decide voluntarily what people should be paid. To accomplish that, though, you need organization, you need courage, you need leaders who have a long vision. In 1983, when I came across my first collection of Lee Kuan Yew's speeches in the library in Toronto, what struck me was the period over which he discussed ideas with ordinary people. He would say to people, if we do this in 10 years' time, we should see X. If we do that in 20 years' time, we will see Y. And you'll see over here that he avoided the pitfalls of populism. Lee Kuan Yew, let us be clear, was no Madame Teresa. He was not the sort of person who would maybe qualify to be a prime minister of a nice country like Canada or Australia. He battled with communists. He had a preventive detention act, like many an African country, and he used it with some vigor. But he ensured that his government was a government of incorruptible characters. He ensured that the leaders in his party combined political courage with a high degree of facility in economics. And the consequence of that was he understood that the most important state was a state of full employment. Kwame Nkrumah, first president of Ghana, said, "Seek ye first the political kingdom and all else shall be added." Well, Ghana did get the political kingdom. It is questionable how much more they got. In the case of Singapore, he seemed to have acted on the proposition, "Seek ye first the state of full employment and all else shall be added." So all of the policies of Singapore are directed towards the creation of a state of full employment. What exactly does that entail? First thing is the quality of leadership. Here is Lee Kuan Yew in 1966, age 43, not very different from you. There are two types of individuals who emerge in positions of leadership. If your country is developed, leadership are people with a firm grip of the nuts and bolts of life, of standards of living and the economy of life. And so Mr. Wilson is an economist of some repute. Mr. Holt has spent many years as a treasurer, as finance minister. As I looked around the conference table at Marlborough House recently, the Commonwealth Conference in '66, I saw emerging the other kind of leadership. I looked at two young colonels representing the governments of Nigeria and Ghana. I say to all law students, pray that my successor will be an economist. Then you have a future. If my successor is a young colonel, then yours is the ignominious role of a mercenary and a paid hack in some unfortunate tribunal. Ghana's international airport is still named after that colonel. Interestingly, the two countries I can think of in Africa who seem to have listened to the very last 3 sentences are South Africa and Botswana. Nelson Mandela, a lawyer, like Lee Kuan Yew, followed by Thabo Mbeki, an economist. Botswana, Seserecha Khama, a lawyer, followed after an interval by Festus Mogae. Candor. Listen to Lee Kuan Yew, age 44. The problem which we have already begun to solve is to get rid of this attitude that you owe me a living. I was born here. According to the Charter of Human Rights, I'm entitled to the following rights: minimum wage, holidays with pay, education, and so on. It is this attitude that we have set out to dispel. Unless you dispel this belief that this world owes us a living, then none of our other problems will ever be solved. We live on a continent where politicians believe that the world owes us a living. There are all manner of theories. In West Africa, it is reparations for slavery. In South Africa, it is recovery from apartheid. Here is a country which believes that despite their hardships, no one owed them anything. How do you create a society of prosperity? By discipline. Which institutions must be disciplined? Start with the government. Listen to Lee Kuan Yew again. Whatever the evils of British or French or Dutch colonial administrations, they provided firm, rigid frameworks within which constructive endeavor was rewarded. Seldom were colonial budgets ever in deficit. They invariably spent less than what they got out of each colony, for colonies were intended to provide profits, not incur losses. They kept stern discipline and stable conditions, sound currencies, good sanitation, and healthy conditions. It is sad to see how in many countries, national heroes have let their countries slide down the drain to filth and squalor, corruption and degradation, where the kickback and the rake-off is a way of life, and the whole country sinks in self-debasement and despair. How many of us know how true those words are? Singapore, in a nutshell, then went from a country with no savings in 1960 to a country where 40% of the GDP was saved and the country boomed. Leaders must be honest about the nature of progress. Here, he's in Malaysia, the center of the Bumiputra policy, speaking to the Malays. Of course, there are Chinese millionaires in big cars and big houses. Is it the answer to make a few Malay millionaires with big cars and big houses? How does telling the Malay bus driver that he should support the party of his Malay director and the Chinese conductor to join another party of his Chinese director, how does that improve the living standards of the Malay bus driver and the Chinese bus conductor, who are both workers of the same company? It is just splitting workers up. Substitute Chinese with white, Malay with black, and you have an early and trenchant criticism of South Africa's BE policies. That is honesty. The fact of the matter, unfortunately, is that great leaders are rare. Plato observed this thousands of years ago. I don't think it is reasonable for us to look for Lee Kuan Yews, but there is hope for us. This is a slide comparing Singapore with Hong Kong. Singapore arguably has switched from being a British colony to a Chinese colony. But what is interesting is that Hong Kong has not produced a Lee Kuan Yew. If you look at all of those statistics, there's hardly any difference between those two countries. Per capita income roughly the same, corruption perception index not too bad, budget balances the same, subsidized healthcare for everybody, subsidized housing for everybody, inflation low, 3.3% in one, 3% in the other. What the two countries have in common, besides being city-states peopled by immigrants, is sound institutions, low inflation, sound courts. All of us can fight for the spread of those institutions in our country. Good people must take action. Lee Kuan Yew, age 44. Evil does not need active cooperation. All evil needs to succeed is quiescence. Abstention on the part of good men who watch evil, feel it is wrong, but do nothing about it, and they succeed. We cannot allow that in our world. Amilcar Cabral of Guinea-Bissau said, "Tell no lies, claim no easy victories." Singapore shows what happens when you take Amilcar Cabral seriously. Thank you.